Thank you and good afternoon to everyone here. I'd like to first thank the organizers and all of you here in the audience for allowing me to provide a private sector perspective on how government and industry can work together to both improve defenses and limit conflict. As I am Microsoft, I'm going to have PowerPoint presentation different than some of the other speakers. What you didn't hear in my background is that for about 5 years of my career, I supported the US government in helping to both stand up and execute on public-private partnerships focused on national security and critical infrastructure protection. Once I joined Microsoft, I spent about 3 years supporting public-private partnerships through multilateral organizations like ITUD, the development sector, focused on capacity building and developing in emerging markets. And then most recently, I've been back in Washington, D.C., and leading a public-private partnership of about 125 IT companies working with the US government on, again, critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity. Like the previous speaker, I'd like to say what I've learned through those experiences is that public-private partnerships are vitally essential to making progress on cybersecurity. But they're not easy. While there is a consistency of shared willingness and a recognition of the value of the approach, there have been challenges in effectuating meaningful progress through them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit in my presentation about some of the lessons learned that I think can help with this. So very briefly here at the beginning, I'm going to give a little bit on how we see the cyber risk environment. So I think this is an illuminating graphic. When you look here at the graphic, basically the size of the box shows the size of the internet population, and this is from 2005. The saturation of the color of the box shows how much of the percentage of the population was online at that point in time. So in 2005, what you can see is the vast majority of the internet population was in US, Western Europe, and coming on board in Asia. And so from a NATO perspective, you were thinking about developing policy or taking operations in cyberspace, you had a fairly small community to work with at that point in time. Moving forward, looking at 2025, the world is a very different place. The size of the internet population in China exceeds that of the US and European Union combined. We have, in this graphic, I think what I like to describe as a device-rich north. You're going to have users in the northern hemisphere that are all using at least 5 to 10, maybe 20 different devices, and a global-rich south. But why is that really important? Ultimately, this is important because the technical, operational, and policy decisions that are coming out of organizations like NATO and the countries that comprise NATO affect the cyber risk environment of these users. And potentially more important than that, their decisions affect the cyber risk environment here. It is a globally interconnected society, and we are now dependent on each other and affecting each other in new ways. And you have to move that forward into how you think about policy and effectuating change in this environment. I'm not going to spend that much time on this slide, but basically this highlights that there are also technology trends in addition to the demographic trends. We're talking about a greater diversity of platforms, a greater number and diversity of devices, people connecting to cloud services, and creating data at volumes that were unprecedented previously. Ultimately, what does this mean for the cyber risk environment? You have a lot of different actors, state actors, cyber criminals, non-state actors, whether that's industry or other hackers in that environment, who have varying objectives. Some of them are national security objectives. Some of them are financial objectives. Some is just competitive advantage. And they can take a variety of different actions and cause impacts, some of which have not been discussed in terms of the societal acceptance of those impacts. In this environment, I really like a quotation from the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper's most recent testimony before the Hill. Ultimately, the cyber risk environment is a permissive environment. Regardless of who the actors are, They feel like they can take actions in this environment with little to no consequence in return. So lots of different actors can do lots of different things, and they don't feel deterred from taking action in this space. That's a bit of a challenge and something that this entire room has to be thinking about. So let's talk a little bit about how defenses are being improved. So of course, governments have recognized this technological dependence, and they're taking public policy action in this space. Those are not necessarily always the same. The frame of reference for different governments taking action in this space is oftentimes different. You have governments who are thinking about managing and protecting the risk of systems. Things like critical infrastructure protection efforts oftentimes focus on systems. Things like how governments think about managing their enterprise environments is a system-type approach. When I see what's going on in the European Union with the Network and Information Security Directive, that's a slightly different lens of reference. That is a lens that recognizes that society is fundamentally dependent on information technology. And so they're thinking not just about protecting a system, but how do I ensure that societal dependence is managed in an appropriate way? To the far right on this slide, there are also certain challenges that are coming up with sovereignty. Our previous speaker noted that there is a, what's going on in internet governance? And there was a question from the back, multi-stakeholderism or multilateralism. What I have noticed is that whether you're talking about individual nation sovereignty or multilateral forums that have historically helped manage transborder risk, these are oftentimes being challenged by the transborder aspect of cyber threats. So governments have a few complicated roles in this space. First of all, they're protectors. Protectors of national security and protectors of public safety. And they're taking actions to do that. They are also major users of technology. Two speakers before me, there was a question about how to actually get better and more secure technology in this space. As users of technology, governments and organizations like NATO can demand security through their procurement power and drive via the marketplace considerable improvements in this space. But governments are also exploiters of technology, seeking to fulfill valid national security objectives and also monitors in this space. What that really creates when you're in the private sector is a series of pressures on innovation. We see governments who are improving validly their defensive capabilities. You can see the numbers up on the screen. Others who have started to articulate specific offensive strategies, 17 around the world at this point in time. And at the same time, because they see these actions going on, they're saying to the private sector, we're going to develop legislative initiatives to help manage risk in your environment. 95 countries doing that right now, and 54 countries with a strategy. That creates a tension and oppression on innovation. We've got a push and a pull from the left and the right challenging the environment. So in addition to the concerns that businesses are seeing from government compliance and regulatory requirements, we're also seeing liability coming in other forms. Civil liability coming in the context of data breach. Civil liability coming in the context of negligence. Civil liability coming in the context of, are you meeting a standard of care? Because that is a conversation that is emerging. I spoke probably 6 weeks ago with a group of general counsels from Fortune 100 companies. And I'm telling you what, they're concerned. There is an awareness of cyber risk that I've never seen in my 15 years of this business. And it is driving action. So when I talk with these folks in the conversations, I like to highlight that we are not moving away from the foundations. It is continually important to focus on risk management. In the context of risk management, though, it was for many years a focus on protection. But now, increasingly, we also have to think about detection and response. Only two types of companies in the world, people have heard this quotation before, those who have been hacked and those who don't yet know they've been hacked. In this space, you really do have to think about a comprehensive and holistic approach to managing security. When you think about enterprise risk management, one other thing I like to talk about with folks is, previously we used to talk about business continuity. So what was important to you? What was critical to you? In the environment that I just talked about, with both state and non-state actors taking various actions to exploit systems in cyberspace, you also have to think about a counterintelligence point of view. It's not only about what's important to me, it's also about what might be important to an adversary. So thinking about that and focusing on that what is critical from both perspectives is very important. In the context of due diligence, what can and are enterprises doing in this space? I think it is really important to note that when I talk with regulators and when I talk with auditors, they are really focused on due diligence. They appreciate that there are going to be breaches that happen. So in that context of due diligence, we talk a lot about making sure you have an information security plan and an incident response plan, that you have assets and resources ready to be deployed against those, that you are exercising them regularly, using them in practice, and based on experience, improving them over time. Companies are also thinking quite a bit about how to do governance. This has moved from being the CIO and CISO conversation. I speak quite often now with boards who are saying, what are our responsibilities here? We've seen the Target attacks, Home Depot attacks, Tesco attacks, the attacks on the European Central Bank. We see liability and we want to know how to manage it. Things that we talk about in this space is you need to make sure you have that strong governance, use standards. That piece here on third-party risk is one that those people who are more savvy in cybersecurity are thinking about. Whether it's dependence on vendors, dependence on cloud services, there are other points of entry into your environment, and that is something we encourage organizations to really think about. How do you manage third-party risk? It's important to do regular audit, and as I noted already, continuous improvement. When you talk, if you have an incident in your environment, a business has an incident in their environment, when an auditor comes in or a regulator comes in, they're going to be looking to say, have you been working to improve your processes over time? The last piece here in thinking about what boards are doing and what businesses are doing is oversight and accountability. In the context of risk management, what I hear most often, whether I'm talking with a government or an enterprise, is what do I do to mitigate that risk? And I think it's really important that we help folks understand risk management has three key components. We're going to mitigate some of them, we're going to transfer some of them, and some of them you're going to accept. And that tolerance, that risk tolerance, is going to fundamentally vary by the organization. The tolerance of an innovator in a startup is not necessarily going to be the same as the tolerance of an organization like mine. The resources that they can apply are not necessarily the same as, again, an organization like mine or another cloud service provider like Amazon can apply. But there are other ways to think about this. The cyber insurance market is growing. Now, I will say personally, I don't think it's going to be at the place that has been spoken about. I don't think it's going to be the solution to everything in the next 5 years. But it is growing as we get more information out on incidents that are occurring and start to see the impacts. That provides actuarials data so they can start to build out a market in this space. But when you have a board-level conversation, a couple of things that I talk about with folks is, first of all, don't look at your cyber risk in a silo. These things, whether you're talking about the risk or the investments, should be looked at in the context of your business objectives. What are you seeking to achieve? What are your concerns that are coming at you? The other thing here is that most of these senior level leaders are not cyber savvy. And we don't necessarily want them deciding, which firewall vendor I'm going to choose for X, Y, or Z. They're supposed to be running a business. So, what are the ways that we can use frameworks to help them understand cyber risk in the context of those business objectives? One of the things that is really valuable in this space is industry benchmarking. Here's what I'm doing. What is that relative to what someone else is doing? Am I doing enough? I think that is a very important emerging area of practice. When you talk to any of the major auditors, there's more and more industry benchmarking that's going on. At the same time, I also encourage people not to solely focus on what's going on in industry benchmarking, because attackers are not just going, who's the easiest target? When there's an advanced persistent threat, they are usually targeting a specific entity and determined to get in. And if they want to, they will. So what's important about that overall discussion of what's going on in the business environment is that the market and regulatory pressures are driving increased investment in security in a way that had not been going on previously. In the context of public-private partnerships, we have long noted that PPPs should focus on the delta, or the difference between what the market's going to drive and what national and international security needs. So the reason I wanted to highlight that was the market is going to do more. That bottom level of what the market is going to drive is going up. But there's still a gap. That work is very important and meaningful. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I'll explain why. So there are changes that are occurring by both governments and industry. Behavioral changes and changes in capability that have fundamentally altered the relationship between government and industry. For the longest time, we have talked about how government and industry are interdependent. We depend on one another. And that hasn't changed at all. But we are now also intermingled in ways that I think were not necessarily anticipated. We are both partners and increasingly peers. So let me build out this just a little bit. In the context of being partners, industry and government both do protection. And consistent with traditional public-private partnerships, we've worked to identify those things that are critical and help protect them. We also both do detection. Historically, this was a space where governments were a little bit stronger. However, in recent years, industry's capabilities in this space have advanced considerably. Whether you're talking about industry developing open source intelligence, or industry being able to do attribution, industry's capabilities in detection have grown. You can only look at the Mandiant report on some of the Chinese actors, or what Kaspersky has been able to do in terms of identifying particular actor sets and their capabilities. Industry has advanced in what it can do in detection. And there's a reason here that in response I have that little dashed line and then a red area. Industry and government, through public-private partnerships, must continue to collaborate on responding to incidents. But there is also a space where we have different authorities and different responsibilities. Governments, and NATO, for example, have different authorities to be able to operate outside of their domain in response to a particular cyber attack. That said, there's increasing interest among some in industry of them being able to take actions outside their networks. Now, let me make sure this is really clear. That is not Microsoft's position. but I'm currently characterizing the environment for you all. And we see this going on. There are entire companies whose business models are built on active defense. Oftentimes, these are described or characterized as being defensive in nature, but they can be used in offensive ways. And so there's a new dynamic that's going on in response. In the space of being peers, I think it's really interesting to quote the National Intelligence Office for Cyber from 2012. He said, "Commercial infrastructure is a target and an enabler. It is both a resource and a place from which to launch attacks." We only have to look at the last, 18 to 24 months to know that private sector is the environment in which nation states are often seeking to accomplish their national security objectives. Do we want to talk about Aramco, RasGas, the distributed denial of service attacks against the US banking industry, the destructive attacks against the South Korean banking industry, the destructive attacks that occurred at the Sands Casino in the United States, or the most recent one, and the one that really moved the risk environment into the public consciousness, out of the policymaker space and into a space where my dad called up and said, "Is this what you do?" The Sony attacks. The first time that you had a president go on television do naming and shaming, attribution to an actor, this is a fundamental shift in the risk environment, an inflection point. Both destructive attacks being used against the private sector and awareness of that in the public domain. That then means increasingly government and industry are peers. We're both targets, and increasingly they like to shoot at the private sector. We also, as I already noted, the increase in capabilities. At a minimum, in many cases, private sector and government increasingly have converged levels of capabilities. I talked about that in the context of detection. And that last space is, again, the actor space. I highlighted this in response. Whether you're talking about an industry that is interested in hacking back to recover something that was taken from them, or what we also see is that private sector capabilities are being purchased by governments to help effectuate and carry out offensive actions. The innovation is oftentimes occurring in the private sector. Our capabilities are advancing. And so that creates a complicated space in the actor community. What does that really mean? What we see is a concerning escalation of conflict in the environment. Both the range of actors, the methods, the targets, and the victims are expanding. The potential for unintended consequence, unintended escalation, is increasingly high. This was already a complex environment when it was just government on government, state on state action. But when you add in the complexity of private sector operating and government operating in private sector environments, in some parts of industry, again, not us, taking on roles that were traditionally governmental, there's a big potential for something to go a little awry. Let me tell you a little bit about what that means from a private sector perspective. Fundamentally, we're dealing with a distorted threat model. We have regulatory costs that are going up, operational response is very difficult, and we're in the line of sight for reciprocity of state actions, ultimately potentially resulting in a loss of trust. Now, Microsoft, as I said, not one of those actors that is operating in this space. We help people improve defenses and improve information assurance on a global basis. Doesn't matter where my customer sits around the world, we're going to help improve defenses. We build in privacy and security into our products, build trustworthy platforms, and work very actively both to reduce the risk of cybercrime. Many of you might have heard the things we've done in botnet takedowns, and also advocate through forums like this on how to improve cybersecurity. So very briefly, I won't read these. In December of this last year, we put out a paper that includes 6 norms to help limit conflict. Each one of these norms are directed at talking about what states should or should not do. A copy of the paper is out on the booth outside. I encourage you to pick it up. 2 of the norms focus on thinking about how to manage vulnerabilities, making sure that supply chains are not infected into the broad supply chain, and making sure there are responsible ways to manage vulnerabilities. Thinking about restraint in both developing and using weapons, and non-proliferation and control. The last one, really thinking carefully about how to limit operations that don't create mass impact, and I'm going to follow up on that one in a second. And then ultimately working that we are collaborating, like I said, when appropriate, collaborating to help manage incidents that do occur. I want to talk now a little bit about that refined public-private partnership. For the longest time, the first 2 bullets on this slide on each side is where the PPP focused. How do we manage risk, and how do we share information to help each other manage risk? Those roles and responsibilities are not going away. But then each one of them has 4 more bullets after them. And for any of you who haven't noticed, these are parallel structure. The bullet on the left corresponds to the bullet on the right. So when thinking about what we need to be doing to limit conflict, we also have to work on what's the appropriate handling of vulnerabilities? How does the private sector provide expertise to governments on what some of the technical challenges are? And how does government make sure that we are in a space to listen to that and really understand unintended consequences? How does the private sector help identify those critical infrastructure functions that really could cause mass effect consequences? And let's talk about how to take them out of the state of play. From a government side, increasing transparency. I noted earlier that there were 17 governments who had articulated offensive strategies. There are more who have them. Those are just the 17 who have stated them. Increasing transparency here helps limit insecurity. It helps create a greater understanding of action and response. And then last but certainly not least, the private sector has to help governments start to develop cybersecurity norms in this space. And governments need to take action to really define those and implement them. And I'm going to talk a little bit in just a second about how I think that should be done in a very pragmatic way. So fundamentally, we need new engagement models. The engagement models need to be both agile and inclusive. And notice I said appropriately inclusive. In our paper, we talked about something called the G20 plus ICT 20. There need to be representative forums so we can start making decisions and driving things forward. Oftentimes what I've seen is as we have increasing number of stakeholders in this environment, is everyone has an equity and everybody has a seat at the table. I think you really have to think a lot about who can action change, not just who has an equity. In addition, we've got to really make sure it's clear that we are focused on defensive cybersecurity purposes. That's how Microsoft has done public-private partnerships over time, but because of the challenges post-Snowden, there are questions about that. Let's make sure we're really explicit. Finally, second to last, we need to focus on what's truly critical. I know there are lots of different critical infrastructure sectors, but there are some things that are fundamentally more important for cybersecurity and cyberspace. ICT, banks, financial services, energy. Those sectors are more important to make sure we maintain stability and security. There's a great quotation that says, military quotation, a man who defends everything defends nothing. It is a diffusion of effort and a diffusion of expertise if we try and focus on everything. We also need to define much more specific outcomes. It is no longer sufficient to say we need to build cybersecurity norms. We all know that. I think now we need to move into the context of maybe it's not just norms for critical infrastructure. Maybe it's norms for those ones that are most important. That it's norms around the consequences that we want to avoid. To think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Be much more specific about the outcomes. And ultimately, we need to deliver, implement, and iterate. The world is moving too fast for us to be sitting around contemplating policy for 7 years. We might not always get it right initially, but as long as we're committed to working together in an agile way, in iterating, we will make progress. I see I'm about to get pulled off the stage here. So the last thing I'll say is, what I would encourage us to do in advancing persistent security is really commit to this evolved version of public-private partnership, something that drives results, to think beyond the construct of like-minded, to think about where there may be converging interest and diverging interest, and to work bilaterally between governments, between industry and government, and in regional constructs. Because we don't all have the same values or market drivers, and we do need to have this demonstrable, meaningful progress. So think about what are the engagement models and the different forums to bring us together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mike? Yeah, thank you, Angela. I would never pull you off stage, so no worries. Anyway, I think we have time for one quick question, maybe. Yeah, here on the... I know there's excellent food out there. I know you know.
Thank you for this. Richard Hill, again, as a radical civil society activist, I have to say I'm going to agree and endorse everything you said. I think it matches very closely the thinking of my group. I want to drill down on a specific point that you raised and that I asked Vice Admiral Grooms about. You mentioned there's a gap between what the people are taking and what the requirements are in terms of security. There might not be enough security, and governments, that you said, could address that by putting in procurement requirements and so on. I want to drill down and be more specific. When I asked the question to Vice Admiral Grooms, he said, well, you know, if companies offer you a secure email system, you'll buy it. And I think that might be true for institutional users, but not for home users, and I'll illustrate that with one of your products. I use Outlook. I don't have the latest version, but I think it's the same as the version I have. I can sign my messages, but I have to go off to the trouble of getting the key, which is not all that easy for those of you who have done it. Why is Microsoft not shipping it prepackaged with a secure solution? And I would posit that it's because your marketing people don't actually think there's enough of a market to do that. And I wonder whether you could comment on that.
Yeah, so you know, Microsoft has done a lot to evolve and change what it's done in terms of assuring the software assurance and secure development practices. And I think one of the things that's really key that you just highlighted is what enterprises want in this environment and what consumers want in the environment are not necessarily the same. We've done things like Patch Tuesday for years because enterprises wanted predictability in terms of getting patches, and they wanted to be able to test them in their environments before deployment. And we did the same model on the consumer side. But what we've started to realize now is that that model needs to evolve, and we're really thinking about that. Things that have changed over time is when you had a large antitrust suit filed against you and was successful, you become a little hesitant about how much you do when you have market dominance. But then we decided, you know what? We're going to ship operating systems that require people to turn on an antivirus and a firewall. But you're just going to have a drop-down to choose. It doesn't have to be mine. It could be one of any. But I think we are thinking quite a bit about how to help manage these environments. Automatic update is going to be something for people who are still using an on-prem environment. But one of the other innovations that's going to come that I think will help consumers quite a bit and enterprises is going to be the adoption of cloud services, where we stop depending on individual end users in all cases to manage security and are starting to optimize the limited resources around the world to manage security in a cloud environment. So a couple of different things that are going on, but what I appreciate in particular about the question is that what enterprises and consumers want in terms of an outcome of secure environments may be the same, but how they get there is oftentimes different. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Angela, and also for you, our nice little mug.